Schön. Good evening. Welcome to our fourth event in this winter semester's GCSE keynote lecture series. My name is Jens Kugele. I'm head of research coordination, a member of the executive board here at the Center GCSE. And I'm looking forward to a very special event tonight that will invite us into a sort of contact zone between the history of theater, classics, applied theater studies, and the study of culture. As most of you know, our traditional keynote lecture series here at our center offers a prominent platform for established scholars from Germany and abroad. And over the course of the semester, this series provides an opportunity to get acquainted with interdisciplinary perspectives on the study of culture, and also an opportunity to engage in an exchange with the experts in the field. We are thrilled that we are able to welcome tonight Professor Martin Revermann from the University of Toronto, a scholar whose work bridges two scholarly fields, really, classics and theater studies, in a most fascinating way. Thanks very much, Professor Revermann, for accepting our invitation and for joining us tonight. This lecture event has been organized in cooperation with JLU's Classics Department and JLU's Applied Theater Department, and I'm very glad to have three colleagues with me tonight who represent these academic fields, and who all have been continuously engaged in the GCSE as associate professors or principal investigators for years. Professor Bojana Kunst, Professor Gerald Siegmund, and Professor von Möllendorf, who has also laid the foundation for this event, since he has been actually for the last year Martin Revermann's host in the context of his Humboldt professorship here at JLU. And before I hand over to Peter von Möllendorf, who is going to introduce our speaker to you, allow me to add, as always, just a brief note on the format of tonight's event. Directly after the lecture, we'll have first a round of questions and reactions to our presentation from a panel that will serve as a sort of segue into a Q&A, where we include the entire plenum and are also looking forward to your questions and comments. For those who are joining online, during the Q&A, if you would like to pose a question or make a comment, please enter a plus in the chat and we'll be happy to add you to the list. However, if you prefer to, you may also just write out your question or comment directly in the chat and we'll be happy to read it out. And tonight's event will be recorded. The recording, however, is as always limited to the audio and video of our presenters, and the recording does not include any of the Q&A session afterwards, neither does it include chat activity or any metadata regarding the participants of this session. So please join me in welcoming Martin Revermann, as well as Bojana Kunst, Gerald Siegmund, and Peter von Möllendorf, who is going to share some words of introduction. Thanks.
Okay, good evening from me too, and I'm very happy to introduce to you Martin Revermann, who is Professor of Classics and Theatre Studies at the University of Toronto, and as all of you can think, he is classical philologist as being Professor of Classics, but he's also cultural historian, a combination which is not so common in Germany. And his particular interests lie in the theatre, in the ancient Greek theatre, but also in the 20th century theatre. In Bertolt Brecht, he just published a very wonderful book about Bertolt Brecht, The Ancient Tragedy. He is working on Greek religion and Greek lyrics and lyrics and Greek poetry, but also modern poetry, and as you see here, the history of science, which will be a subject tonight. He has written a monograph on comic business, on theatricality, dramatic technique, and performance context of Aristophanic comedy, which brought us together, but I will say some words to this too. And he wrote on Brecht and tragedy, as I already said. He has edited 5 other books together with other colleagues. He was trained as a classicist in Germany, especially in Munich, and in the United Kingdom, and he holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. He also had research fellows at Oxford University, at Merton College, at the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, at the School of Advanced Study in London, and at Cambridge University. And in 2022, he was awarded the Humboldt Prize, for which he is now here. And now, as we are a very international group, and as everybody here will understand some German, I I conclude with some personal remarks, but in German, because wir kennen uns aus gemeinsamen Jahren vor der Jahrtausendwende am Institut für Klassische Philologie in München, also schon seit einem Vierteljahrhundert, sogar etwas mehr. Und so war es mir natürlich eine sehr große Freude, ihn für den Humboldt-Forschungspreis vorzuschlagen. Und angesichts der vielen Aktivitäten, von denen ich gerade gesprochen habe, und der vielen, vielen Publikationen, war diese Bewerbung sozusagen, also dieser Vorschlag, quasi ein zwar arbeitsaufwendiger, aber doch Selbstläufer. Die Stiftung konnte eigentlich gar nichts anderes tun, als ihm den Preis zu verleihen. Und entsprechend hat sie dann auch gehandelt. Wir haben jetzt eine sehr schöne trilaterale Kooperation hier in Gießen, Toronto und der Scuola Normale di Pisa und bereiten ein umfangreiches Projekt zur Theorie und Praxis der Übersetzung der alten Sprachen vor, das im Jahr der Förderung durch nämlich also jetzt 2023 hier durch 3 Workshops vorangetrieben wurde. Der erste fand eben 2023 hier in Gießen statt, der zweite dann im Herbst 2023 in Toronto und der dritte wird im Frühsommer dieses Jahres in Pisa folgen. Das Ergebnis soll ein wirkliches dickes Buch sein, das auf Griechisch Megabiblion heißen würde, und die des Griechisch-Kundigen wissen, wie dieser Spruch sich normalerweise fortsetzt, nämlich Megakakon. Ein dickes Buch ist ein dickes Übel. Aber wir hoffen, dass es natürlich kein dickes Übel sein wird, sondern ein Practical Guide to Translation, also ein Buch sein wird, das in vielen Einzelkapiteln tatsächlich alle Facetten des Übersetzens aus den alten Sprachen, nicht nur literarischer und fachlicher Texte, sondern auch Inschriften, auch Fragmente, Übersetzung von Fragmenten, aus der wir aus der Antike einiges haben, eben so darstellt, dass man daraus auch wirklich praktische Konsequenzen für die eigene Tätigkeit ziehen kann. Und dieses Buch ist für Publikationen ja gar nicht immer so selbstverständlich, wirklich schon sehr weit fortgeschritten. Also wir sind doch sehr optimistisch, dass das womöglich Ende dieses Jahres, Anfang nächsten Jahres, aber dann auch erscheinen wird. Ja, das ist das, was ich zu sagen hätte. This is what I had to say. And now it's your turn.
Thank you very much for these two very kind very kind introductions there, Jens and Peter, as well. It's an absolute pleasure to be here at the GCSE. I was here some years ago. I absolutely loved the atmosphere. It was wonderful. And I'm sure today will be exactly the same. Auch ich möchte mich ganz herzlich bei dir bedanken, Peter. Die Humboldt-Stiftung sagt in den Hochglanzprojekten immer offene und vertrauensvolle Zusammenarbeit. Und du warst wirklich, und du bist immer ein wirklich ganz hervorragender Kooperationspartner. Immer offen, immer kritisch und immer konstruktiv. Ich hätte es nicht besser treffen können. Ich bin dir ausgesprochen dankbar. All right, theatre of science. This essentially will be my starting point, and if you will, the big picture, the theatre of science. Can those two interact, the theatre and the science? And here's your quick run through what I have to say. They can, they do. They have been for a long time, in fact. They will continue to. And perhaps the last one, they should, including at this university. So just a warning, if you will, or a preconditioning at the very end of this paper. I don't want to localize. I would like to pose the question to what extent actually in this particular place, things like the kind of ideas that I have can or might possibly be implemented. And that's another reason why I was so keen to present right here, because as an outsider, it seems to me that the GCSE is one of those venues that is actually primed to be taking on something like this in one shape or another in particular. Yeah, you saw it on the very first slide. Here it is again. A science COVID mask. Why did you choose this particular mask? It may not be as well known in this particular country, but if you went through COVID in North America, you may be familiar with this particular person. This is Dr. Anthony Fauci, the now just retired, so the former head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the United States, who during the COVID pandemic in the US and also in Canada became a bit of an icon. So he actually became a household name. And what you see here is Dr. Fauci in one of these congressional hearings that he was asked to do as part of justifying, explaining, and so forth, COVID-related measures to Congress. And what he regularly did in those meetings, he would be wearing what I brand a COVID mask. What you see on this previous slide, if you will, is another version of it that I was able to acquire on my own. You can, at least you could, actually purchase these science masks even on Amazon. Let me perhaps go back to this particular model, if you will, of the science mask, because it already actually has some key elements of the theatricalization of sciences right here. Of course, you have these key props, the microscope, these test tubes right here with this. I shouldn't leave my place, should I? I will use this with these colorful liquids, of course, a cell right here, a telescope, rockets. Then, of course, some experiments. These are the so-called Newton cradle or the Newton pendulum, a pulley right here. Here you have an apple, and that's, of course, Newton's apple. For those of you who've perhaps recently seen the Oppenheimer movie, early on, there's a very interesting apple-related, poisoned apple-related thing that also plays with the history of the Newton apple, if you will. Then, of course, you have abbreviations, cosine right here, biology, limes, mathematical, of course, E equals mc square. Then you have pi as an irrational number and so forth. So that mask already tells you very interesting things about the theatricalization of sciences, going for these focalizers, if you will, right? Going for props, going for formulae, going for key, if you will, spectacular experiments. I will come back to that soon. Question, what kind of experiments actually do lend themselves particularly for theatricalization and why? So this whole array, if you will, of the sciences, and last but not least, of course, color. This perhaps you see even more on this particular Fauci mask, how this is a very dynamic lab with all these very flamboyant colors that, if you will, dynamize the usually quite drab scientific lab environment and theatricalizes. Now, the interesting question, of course, is why did Dr. Fauci put on this particular mask? I mean, he had all kinds of options, black, white, whatever. Why this particular thing? And of course, here you're starting to think in these theatrical / sociological ways. One person I like to co-opt in this kind of cultural analysis is the Canadian, as it happens, sociologist Irving Goffman, behavior in public places, putting on the front a persona, social drama, right? And here you see someone like Dr. Fauci putting on this particular mask, putting on a dramatic persona. Persona, by the way, of course, a Latin word, actually means mask. The statement is, I'm a scientist first and foremost. He is, and this is again in Goffmanian terms, he is being a strategic actor who uses this particular mask as, if you will, a billboard. And of course, that's also very much designed. The real target audience, the notional audience of this is not necessarily Congress and the politicians he's actually confronted with, but really the screen, of course, right? The streaming video, the YouTube video, whatever, that actually gets this particular frontal view of him with the mask. So there is a billboard, and he's underlining, of course, the fact that he's here not as a politician, not as an advocate, not as a lobbyist. He is here as a scientist. And that has implications for what he is about to say, that has implications for falsifiability, that has implications for error, for method, and so forth. So it's actually a very, very important statement that is wrapped and communicated via theatrical channels. Theatrical channels because, among other things, apart from being a COVID mask, it's also, of course, a mask. And in that sense, if you will, if not the theatrical device. There are a number of very important theatrical traditions in the Western and the non-Western hemisphere that, of course, use masks. The middle one, that's, of course, the Greek one. But here, Balinese theater, here's the Japanese no mask, Commedia dell'arte masks. Just a very brief reminder about this particular mask. This is, of course, a half mask, and it's unusual also in that it actually obscures the lower part of the face. Usually, of course, in a half mask, you want it the other way around. So here, this is actually a mask that is not necessarily theatrically usable, or that, if you will, is theatrically almost impeded, if you will, because it actually, if you will, cordons off the lower part of the face. Nonetheless, it has, of course, this billboard function. So it is, if you will, it's still very much a covert mask, of course. And in some ways, it's actually non-theatrical. At the same time, it uses these theatrical, if you will, strategies. Yeah, so I used this as an opener just to, and I should tell you, and Peter already alluded to this, so this is a monograph project of mine, the Theatre of Science. And I also do a fair amount of teaching. Actually, right now in Toronto, I'm doing 2 seminars, actually, in comparative literature and with actors, actually, on this particular topic. And one angle, the one I will talk a bit less about tonight, is instances of scientists themselves actually using theatrical and performance techniques and performance art for communicating results, and of course also for engaging the public. So the experiment, if you will, as a mini drama and a piece of theatre, of science theatre in its own right. There are a number, actually not, I don't think all that many experiments actually that lend themselves to this kind of thing. More about that later. But the, if you will, key exhibit, or one of the key exhibits for this kind of science theatre is Foucault's pendulum in the Pantheon in Paris. So let me spend a few minutes on introducing you to this particular, if you will, experiment, but also the other way of looking at this is a piece of performance art and as an art installation. So there it is. Those of you who've ever been to the Pantheon will not have failed to notice it. We are in the year 1851. In January, very early that particular year, Foucault, very much actually an outsider to the science community, discovers this surprisingly simple but extraordinarily important experiment to demonstrate, and I mean demonstrate in the kind of relatable scale, if you will, the rotation of the Earth. So the pendulum swings and it actually changes its plane of oscillation. And here you see this kind of surrounding circle that actually then, when you come back 2 hours later, the plane of oscillation will have shifted. An artist who actually senses, or sensed, I should say, also the aesthetic value of Foucault's pendulum and actually capitalized this sting. If you go to YouTube, you will see a fairly recent 35-minute concert of Sting, which he did in the Pantheon right in front of the pendulum. I found that really quite interesting, because again, he as an artist realizes this has an intrinsic aesthetic value. Let me just take you very briefly to 1851, and
have you seen the Earth go round? Would you like to see it rotate? Go to the Pantheon on Thursday and until further notice, every following Thursday from 10 a.m. until noon. The remarkable experiment devised by M. Léon Foucault is carried out there in the presence of the public under the finest conditions in the world, and the pendulums suspended by M. Revermann, expert hand, from Soufflot's dome clearly reveals to all eyes the movement of rotation of the Earth.
so this was Jens Kugele impersonating the science reporter Terrien in Le National on March 26, 1851. So you see, about 2.5 months later, after Foucault did this experiment literally in his basement, this experiment is actually being carried to the public. It is highly reproducible. It's one of those experiments, and I didn't know this until quite recently, actually. Many scientific experiments, especially in microbiology, actually are not or very difficult to reproduce or even replicate. The pendulum experiment is one of those very portable, very mobile and easily reproducible kind of experiments. And of course it has this kind of spectacular aspect to it, right? And this very easy, if you will, relatability. And there it is. For the remainder of the year, this will actually continue to be, if you will, an installation, an art installation at the Pantheon. Of course, the venue is extraordinarily important, right? The Pantheon has just been reconfigured, if you will, to become, if you will, the church of the revolution, the church for French national pride, if you will, the mausoleum for the great minds of the French nation. Actually changes over those years, various times it changes its function from church then back to mausoleum and so forth. So it's of course an extraordinarily, if you will, potent venue to demonstrate, also given the history of this problem, because of course here we are at this fundamental issue about geocentric versus a heliocentric world view, for which people have literally burned at the stake, like Giordano Bruno and so forth. So it's an extraordinary kind of mixture and extraordinary kind of politicized space in which this particular experiment is taking place. Just a little bit, because again, in this project, that's actually very important to me, that when humanities people and scientists talk, I do think each clientele, each stakeholder group, if you will, has to leave comfort zones. So when with my comparators and my theatre students, we do have the occasional formula on the blackboard, and the scientists or engineers I work with or hope to work with will have to read texts. So here is the sine law. You see it right at the bottom. So the equation, which this essentially boils down to, is Ti, the time it takes for the plane of oscillation to shift, to go around, if you will, one circle. That is calculated, is equals 24 divided by the sine of theta, and theta is essentially the latitude. That means if you're here on the left side, on the equator, the latitude is 0, so the sine is 0, and the plane of oscillation does not change. At the North Pole, the latitude is 90 degrees, the sine of 90 degrees is 1, and the plane of oscillation is 24. Gießen is latitude 50 degrees, the sine of 50 degrees is 0.76. So in Gießen, Foucault's pendulum takes 31.5 hours to change its plane. So it's different, has different lengths depending on where you are on this world. And that's precisely what happened in 1851. Immediately, this particular experiment traveled. It traveled to the northern hemisphere, it traveled to the southern hemisphere. That was particularly important, actually, to show that it actually works in both hemispheres, Rio de Janeiro and whatnot. And the final, if you will, public, and again, highly charged, politically charged, if you will, exhibit of this experiment in December 1851 in Rome. In the Vatican, where this particular experiment then actually took place. And to the present day, Foucault's pendulum is an experiment which you can regularly actually, if you will, experience on all kinds of university campuses and so forth. There was a pendulum mania in the United States and so forth. All right, this is a restaging of this particular experiment in 1902. Again, here you actually see how you start this particular experiment. That's actually quite interesting. So here you have this bob that then oscillates. It's very important to get this bob into the right, if you will, trajectory. So what happens is it's fastened by a very thin thread, and then someone comes along with a lighter and actually, if you will, burns this little thread, and then the bob actually starts to swing. This is precisely the, if you will, the highly dramatic kind of opening of this particular experimental script when the bob is actually being released. That brings me then, so I've just looked at, again, the experiment and this particular spectacular experiment as one example of scientists using clearly theatre and performance techniques in order to communicate, highlight, create awareness, relatability, tactability, if you will, persuasion and so forth, to make it prominent in that sense. One of the things, and that's possibly actually for me personally the most important result of this entire project, that I'm convinced that in the 21st century actually the sciences will need the theatre actually more than ever, to educate, to convince, and to effect behavioral change. And that is because of the nature of the challenges that we are facing, that we are sure to face in this century. And at this point of the century, I think we can already say, for instance, that physics and cosmology have been replaced, if you will, as the most important sciences by life sciences, by environmental sciences, of course, by AI. All these are alluded to on my slides right here. So this leads me to this particular slide. Why will the sciences need the theatre? Three aspects seem to me to be of particular importance here. The aspect of impact. So all these scientists that I believe are key sciences in the 21st century, like AI, like genetics, like environmental sciences, are what I call embodied sciences. So it's different from, let's say, cosmology or physics. It's one thing to do research on dark holes, and it's one thing to do things on nuclear fission and on nuclear particles, whatever. So there we are in the extraordinarily macro or the extraordinarily micro or nano kind of dimension. The key sciences, those that are of greatest import to us in the 21st century, I believe, are embodied sciences that affect our bodies at our normal scale, if you will, that affect our individual bodies, collective bodies, and of course also the body Earth that we're actually living in. And as embodied sciences, they already share, of course, a crucial element actually with theatre being an embodied type of performance art. So embodied sciences which will have profound impact on the actual lives of individuals and groups. And one consequence of that is point number 2, the need for consent. Many of these scientific advancements will require some form of individual and or collective consent. Take COVID. It's one thing to come up with a COVID vaccine, and it was absolutely amazing and astonishing how fast these vaccines were actually being developed using untested revolutionary techniques. But it's another thing to get people to consent to have it injected into their bodies. And that's actually part, I would argue, not just of the scientific task, that's, I will ask later, that's, I think, actually has to be part of a reconceptualized notion of scientific knowledge. I think scientific knowledge needs a broader kind of understanding, and this is, of course, where theatre performance arts can make a very serious contribution. And then lastly, the need for behavioural change to be sustainable over time. Again, many of these, like climate change, these are not things that's part of the challenge of climate change, that it has this kind of time dimension that we don't normally think in. We don't normally think in terms of 100, 250, 500 years in advance. It's a genuine, I think, cognitive challenge for our species to think in these kind of dimensions. So to be sustainable, many scientific insights will need long-term changes of individual and collective behavior. And again, this kind of attitudinal dimension, again, I think privileges and actually requires thinking about theatre and performance techniques at this particular point. All right, so that was, if we will, the one angle. Again, looking at this from the science angle, what I would like to spend a bit more time on is the other side of that equation. So historically, how has the theatre responded to the sciences, and what perhaps can be drawn from that? And here I have selected 3 key areas and 3 case studies. You may or may not be surprised to hear that this subgenre, if you will, of science plays is actually a very quite substantial kind of genre. They're kind of some, if you will, usual candidates. Revermann, the physicist, of course, Brecht's Galileo, which will come up, the Faust plays by Marlowe and by Goethe, Copenhagen by Michael Frayn and whatever. But there's a number, and a growing number actually, of perhaps less well-known plays, some of which I may be mentioning later or may come up in the discussion. Increasingly, I should just say, I see at least 2 tendencies in these more recent science plays. One is an increasing awareness of the collaborative nature of the sciences, and that includes a much greater awareness also of female researchers. For instance, play Photograph 51 by Anna Ziegler, which highlights the crucial role by the scientist Rosalind Franklin in the discovery of the DNA double helix. So it's not just Watson and Crick. She actually made the photographs, and it's arguably the case that Watson and Crick actually deliberately undermined and kind of sabotaged a proper acknowledgement of Rosalind Franklin's role. A fantastic play, Wit, by Margaret Edson, which is about life sciences. It's about a cancer patient. Again, this female dimension and the collaborative dimension. A second shift that I see is very clearly a shift towards life sciences, in particular environmental sciences. There's an increasing number now of climate change related plays. One of the most recent ones, The Trials by Dawn King. I'll do actually tomorrow. Have to teach tomorrow actually in Toronto via Zoom, and we will doing a reading actually of that particular play. Or Chantal Bilodeau, Canadian playwright, who's working on an Arctic cycle, 7 plays actually. 1 plays Sealer. Perhaps briefly more about this. My 3 case studies here are what is, in my view, the first science play, although I don't think it's ever been looked at in this manner, The Clouds by Aristophanes from 423 BCE. Experiment-based, if you will, that particular scene. Experiment number 2, and the physicist's laughter, you will quickly see what that's all about. That's The Life of Galileo. Brecht, 1955. There are 2 versions, 1955-56 is, for my purposes, the more interesting one. And then finally, Staging Artificial Intelligence and Robotics. That is RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots by Karol Čapek from 1920, which also actually invented the word robot. It's actually a neologism in Czech, and it alludes to it's built from the Czech word for forced labor, for serf labor, robota, forced labor. So you can already see there's a very strong economic and, if you will, industrial kind of aspect to the etymology of this particular term, and that's also present in this particular play. Okay, number 1. Aristophanes' Clouds, a peasant, Strepsiades, wants to get rid of his debt and so forth, and he actually goes to this quack, Socrates, who we now think, in part because of the Platonic lens of what we know about Socrates, is a moral philosopher. But lo and behold, the way he's actually being launched in this particular play, so Clouds is named after its chorus, a chorus of clouds who are now actually new gods, and the whole thing is about Socratism, if you will, arguing for and replacing the traditional gods, and the new cloud deities are now being worshipped and so forth. But at least in its opening scene, I should say, just before the arrival of the chorus, as Socrates is being launched into view, there's this scene here. This is the cover image of my first book, Comic Business, and I simply use it because it's inspired by this particular scene, and better than anything I was able to find, it illustrates what this particular scene is about and why, in my view, this qualifies to be listed under science play. So there is Socrates, and by whatever kind of stage means, he's been swung into the audience's view. By the way, the bottom right person, they're supposed to be me. Then there are various other people I've been working with. Anyway, in this condensed kind of caricature, we find out earlier through narration, and then we're also being shown that these kind of Socratic disciples conduct all kinds of weirdo experiments. For instance, they measure free jumps, we are being told. They are conducting astronomy with their ass. That's this one right here. Everyone is asking me who that actually is. The answer is, of course, whoever you want it to be. There is then Socrates being swung into view. They do all kinds of other things. They do geography and so forth. So in particular, as Socrates has been swung on the crane, surely, into view, he has this memorable scene. It's actually, this memorable quote is actually being repeated at the very end of the play as well. I'm airwalking. So Strepsiades, the peasant, is asking what Socrates are actually doing. I'm airwalking and thinking around the sun. Aerobato kai periphronauton helion. And then in his response, he already takes his thinking around the sun, periphrono, as hyperphronein, as hubris. You think beyond the sun. So it's already this sense early on that whatever quote-unquote science or pseudoscience, whatever these people are conducting there, it's a dangerous thing to do. It's actually some kind of overstepping of boundaries. The quack scientist as an overreacher and a threat to well-established social norms. Ridiculous and dangerous paradigm changes, and this is in fact how this comedy in an extraordinary fashion actually ends. It ends with Strepsiades actually, if you will, recanting after his son actually starts beating him and starts, if you will, to abandon all kinds of social mores, and he ends up with support, or so he believes from the traditional deities, he burns down the thinkery, the Socratic environment, the frontisterion. To kind of make things easier, for all the 3 case studies, I've put together a slide with what I call pointers. So I'm not saying this is exhaustive, but later for our discussion, this may actually be helpful. So just 7 points, and I will just rush through them right now without a lot of commentary to indicate where I think crucial elements are, and then this may actually facilitate discussion later on as well. Number 1. Inquisitiveness, but so that's, if you will, the positive side of it. But nerdy and pointless, there's something what you might brand the anti-scientific prejudice. It's all quack stuff that is useless. Pointer 2, the emphasis in the scene on things to do with measurement, observation, experimental techniques, like measuring these free jumps. That's of course ridiculous, but on a quote-unquote serious reading of this scene, they're actually using, if you will, deliberate techniques to conduct a particular experiment. It's ridiculous to do it with putting wax on fleas when they jump, whatever, but the thought itself is a scientific thought. You develop some kind of scientific methodology. Pointer 3, the results are or can be counterintuitive. That's what part of the scene is about. Socrates is telling the peasant, we're doing geography here, and here's a map, and he's wondering, here's Athens, and this. So it's also, again, a question of scale. Scale is very important for this kind of thing. The microscale, again, how can you actually make something that eludes our normal day-to-day scale, how can you make that visible? And the theater is able, if you will, to zoom in and zoom out through narrative, through what semanticians call co-coding, through commentary, and through various kinds of props. Yeah, that's pointer 4, the notion of scale, big, small, and theatrical devices used to achieve the right or the relatable kind of scale. Number 5, I find that very interesting. Internal hierarchy. There's a very clear sense that Socrates here on the crane is a godlike figure. Clearly overstepping something, but he's godlike. So there's an internal hierarchy. So science is a collaborative venture that's clearly being felt. Science is a collaborative venture, but this collaboration here is asymmetrical. It's not an equal collaboration. It is an asymmetrical collaboration. Just a brief anecdote here. Several years ago, I talked to a chemist who was telling me of all the things he had just completed his PhD. He was telling me of all the things they were doing in his group and whatever. And at some point I was asking him, what does the professor, the principal investigator, do? And his laconic response was, der Professor denkt. The professor's thinking. So he was implying the professor actually has the time. We're doing kind of the work. So any scientist will tell you when they actually do lab work, there is a sense of collaborative hierarchies and conflict and this kind of thing. So that, again, is actually already very clearly felt in this play. It's actually super interesting. Pointer 6, this notion of the bubble, right? The unworldly, otherworldly kind of science bubble. It's part of the anti-scientific prejudice, if you will, the cult, the sect. Here, there's this interesting thing. They're all pale. They conduct all these things that require being outdoors, but they're actually avoiding outdoors. That's why they're so pale. And 7, arguably the most important pointer really within the scheme of the play, this notion of overreach, this notion of hubris, ludicrous quote-unquote progress, which comes with dangerous moral regress or regression. Progress, quote-unquote, versus regress. Moving on to number 2, and this is now The Life of Galileo, 1955-56, the second version, if you will, of this particular play, The Rise and Fall of a Stargazer. And fortunately, I have been able to recruit 4 star actors who are now actually presenting to us. Whatever. Or would you prefer to stand? Whatever. Sure.
Just go in front of you because otherwise we have to change the mic.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is part of scene 9. Part of scene 9 of The Life of Galileo in the second version, 1955 to 56. There is happiness in doubting. I wonder why.
Every sunny day for the past 2 weeks, I've gone up to the attic, under the roof. The narrow chinks between the shingles let just a thin ray of the light I saw a spot as big as a fly, as smudged as a cloud. It was moving. Why aren't we investigating those spots, Mr. Galilei?
Because we are working on floating bodies.
Mother's got great baskets full of letters. The whole of Europe wants to know what you think. You've such a reputation now. You can't just say nothing.
Rome allowed me to get a reputation because I said nothing.
But you can't afford to go on saying nothing now.
Nor can I afford to be roasted over a wood fire like a ham.
Does that mean you think the sunspots are part of this business?
Galileo does not answer.
All right, let's stick to our bits of ice. They can't hurt you.
Correct. Our proposition, Andrea?
As for floating, we assume that it depends not on a body's form, but on whether it is lighter or heavier than water.
What does Aristotle say?
Discus latus platic.
For God's sake, translate it.
A broad flat piece of ice will float on water, whereas an iron needle will sink.
Why does the ice not sink in Aristotle's view?
Because it is broad and flat and therefore cannot divide the water.
Right.
He takes a piece of ice and places it in a bucket.
Now I am pressing the ice hard against the bottom of the bucket. I release the pressure of my hands. What happens?
It shoots up to the top again.
Correct. Apparently it can divide the water all right as it rises. Fulgantio.
But why can it float in the first place? It's heavier than water because it is concentrated water.
Suppose it were thinned down to water.
It has to be lighter than water, or it wouldn't float.
Aha.
Any more than an iron needle can float. Everything lighter than water floats, and everything heavier sinks.
QED.
Agreed.
Andrea, you must learn to think cautiously. Hand me the needle, a sheet of paper. Is iron heavier than water?
Yes.
Galileo lays the needle on a piece of paper and launches it on the water. Appalled.
What happens?
The needle is floating. Holy Aristotle. They never checked up on him.
They laugh.
One of the main reasons why the sciences are so poor is that they imagine they are so rich. It isn't their job to throw open the door to infinite wisdom, but to put a limit to infinite error. Make your notes.
What is it?
Whenever they laugh, it gives me a turn. What are they laughing about? I ask myself.
Father says theologians have their bells to ring. Physicists have their laughter.
Anyway, I'm glad he isn't looking through this tube so often these days. That was even worse.
What he's doing now is put bits of ice in water. That can't do much harm.
I don't know.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, a bit of context for this particular scene. You perhaps remember at the very beginning, all of Europe is asking Galileo, who is currently a prisoner of the Inquisition, and has been for several years. All of Europe is asking him about Galileo's view on these sunspots, because they correctly assume that these sunspots would have something to do with the movement of the sun and earth relative to each other. Galileo is afraid to conduct these experiments. He says he doesn't want to be roasted like a piece of ham, a clear allusion to Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake in 1600 in Rome. So he goes, if you will, for the cautious experiment here, and this experiment has to do with floating bodies, where the Aristotelians, that Aristotle on the heavens, where Aristotle had predicted that it's not the mass of a body, whether it's heavy or light, it's actually the shape of a body that determines whether it sinks or floats. And then essentially two experiments, one with these ice cubes and the other one, yes, with that iron needle. And do it yourself. You just place this iron needle on water. You might think that actually Aristotle thought it would. He thought for a different reason. He thought it would sink because of its shape. it should, I guess, naively you'd think it should sink because it's heavier than water. It will actually float. The reason for that is actually the surface tension of the water itself. As soon as you put a few drops of washing liquid, dishwashing liquid, onto the surface, this surface film, if you will immediately dissolve, and the iron needle will, in fact, sink. A little bit about this particular scene. It's there in the earlier version from 1938 or 39 as well, but it's even better in this particular one. Again, I have these 7 pointers here. In my view, actually, pointer number 1, I think Peter's line, aha, to me is actually the most important moment in this particular scene. Aha. It's that kind of eureka kind of moment. Aha. And then, of course, the question is, what kind of aha is it? Pointer number 2, an experiment itself is already, if you will, an act of Brechtian Verfremdung. Verfremdung means, it's nothing to do with distancing, alienation, whatever. Verfremdung means to make something weirdly familiar. So there's something that you know, but you know it now differently because it's been presented in a weird and unusual way. And of course, that in many ways is the nature of science itself, actually, right? The Verfremdung, that we have a very weirdly familiar, different view, actually, of the world around us. Everyone thinks, actually, yes, the sun should go around the Earth, because that's when you step outside, and the sun, whatever. Science tells you in a weirdly defamiliarizing kind of way, it's actually the other way around. And that's too, it's actually quite important. I do think there's a strong meta-theatrical dimension here as well. I do think that Brecht is also commenting on his own theatre, namely, of course, his own theatre conceptualized as what he refers to as Theater des naturwissenschaftlichen Zeitalters, the theatre of the scientific age. So there's a meta-theatrical dimension as well. But the important point for my purposes right now is that an experiment itself, and if you will, the scientific endeavor in and of itself, is in a sense Verfremdung. Pointer 3, Galileo seems to have conducted this experiment before, and in fact he had done this about 20 years prior, when in Pisa he actually argued with die-hard Aristotelians. So this piece of theatre of science is more about teaching a research mindset rather than research itself. So it has a strongly pedagogical purpose. I think it's really quite important as well. That's something that I find in my work as well. I do think part of what I'm doing as a researcher really has its most serious applications actually in pedagogical context, in particular post-secondary university-related context, because it forces humanities people and scientists to come together in one room and actually talk about something like that, to see this, if you will, as an enabler, as a point of departure, and then take it further. I'm sorry, I couldn't even count till 7, so there's a repeated pointer number, or 8, I should say. There's a repeated pointer 3, so 3 star. The reaction is laughter. They laugh. I think that's really significant. You might imagine other reactions. You might imagine anger, frustration, schadenfreude, or something like that. Aristotle, stupid, whatever. No, they laugh, and I think the laughter is not derogatory. It's invigorating and energizing. It's kind of blissful, productive doubt. This remark by the little monk, with which the scene started, the little monk says, and this is something Brecht added in the second version, this particular line, there's something there's happiness in doubting. There's something blissful in doubting. Doubt itself has a blissful and productive, blissful and productive dimension. Perhaps some of you know this quite famous Brecht poem, Der Zweifler, the doubter, which in a lyric mode talks about precisely that, if you will, the bliss of doubt, the bliss of having to do it all over again. Pointer 5, falsifiability as a methodological principle. That gets us into Popper, right? And this notion of falsifiability, you assume that every, if you will, hypothesis is in principle true until it has been falsified. And you end up with kind of a set of assumptions that have not been falsified, and then you may actually prioritize between these, if you will, eligible assumptions. Next pointer, why this experiment? Why does Brecht choose this? I think it's in part a question of scale, part a question of reproducibility, and I think in part also a question of simplicity. Brecht really likes to boil down. It has such great effect with extraordinarily simple means, and few experiments actually lend themselves to this kind of theatrical and meta-theatrical dimension. I'm looking at this as we speak. There are a few experiments like this. Perhaps Otto von Guericke and Marktover, perhaps some people have heard of this. This is about about hemispheres and atmospheric pressure and 15 horses on either side trying to, if you will, pull this apart. So there are experiments like that, if you will, spectacular experiments, but they're not all that many. So this is one of them that actually lends itself to this kind of theatricalization. Okay, final case study before I come to my concluding remarks is Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots. And again, we have our cast to give us a short scene from the prologue of this play, just a little bit about this situation. So Rossum's Universal Robots is a robot producing company, still fairly new, under the leadership now of someone called Domain. There's suddenly a guest from Europe. Her name is Helena. She is the daughter of an important businessman, but she also, as she will reveal later, she is there for the League of Humanities. And in this particular scene, Helena, if you will, has to be convinced that the entities that she is interacting with are in fact robots. And this is where we start. Enter Sulla.
Sulla, let Miss Glory look at you.
Standing up and holding up her hand.
So glad to meet you. You must feel terribly dull in this out-of-the-way spot, don't you?
I don't know, Miss Glory. Please sit down.
Sitting down.
Where do you come from?
From there, from the factory.
Ah, you were born there.
Yes, I was made there.
Jumping up.
Sulla is a robot.
I beg your pardon.
Laying his
Yeah.
go ahead.
Sulla isn't angry. See, Miss Glory, the kind of skin we make. Feel her face.
Oh, no, no.
You wouldn't know that she's of different material from us. Turn round, Sulla.
Stop, stop.
Talk to Miss Glory, Sulla. She's an important visitor.
Please sit down.
Go sit down.
Did you have a pleasant crossing?
Oh, yes, certainly.
Don't go back on the Amelia, Miss Glory. The barometer is falling steadily. Wait for the Pennsylvania. That's a very good, powerful vessel.
What's its speed?
20 knots an hour, 12,000 tons. One of the latest vessels, Miss Glory.
Thank you.
A crew of 80, Captain Happy 8 boilers.
That's enough, Sulla. Now show us your knowledge of French.
You know French?
I know 4 languages. I can write, Dear Sir, Monsieur, geehrter Herr, Illustre Seigneur.
What nonsense. Sulla isn't a robot. Sulla is a girl like me. Sulla is naughty of you. Why you don't take part in such a hoax?
I'm a robot.
No, no, you are not telling the truth. Oh, Sulla, forgive me. I know. They forced you to do so, to do it for an advertisement. Sulla, you are a girl like me, aren't you? Tell me now.
I'm sorry, Miss Glory. Sulla is a robot.
You are not telling the truth.
What? Excuse me, Miss Glory. Then I must convince you.
Enter Marius.
Oh, it's me. Oh, sorry. Double casting, where am I? Oh, Marius, take Sulla into the testing room for them to open her. Quickly.
Where?
Into the testing room. When they're cut her up, you can go and have a look.
I shan't go.
Excuse me, you spoke of lies.
You wouldn't have her killed.
You can't kill machines.
Don't be afraid, Sulla. I won't let you go. Tell me, darling, are they always so cruel to you? You mustn't put up with that, Sulla. You mustn't.
I'm a robot.
That doesn't matter. Robots are just as good as we are. Sulla, you wouldn't let yourself be cut to pieces.
Yes,
Oh, you are not afraid of death, then?
I cannot tell, Miss Glory.
Do you know what would happen to you there?
Yes, I should cease to move.
How dreadful.
Marius, tell Miss Glory what you are.
Marius, the robot.
Would you take Sulla into the testing room?
Yes,
Would you be sorry for her?
I cannot tell.
What would happen to her?
She would cease to move. They would put her into the stamping mill.
That is death, Marius. Aren't you afraid of death?
No.
Sicher?
See, Miss Glory, the robots are not attached
no enjoyment, they are less than so much grass.
Oh, stop. Send them away.
Marius, Sulla, you may go.
Right, so here a couple of pictures from early productions of this particular play. The left one is from this particular prologue. And Peter actually, as he was reading, was doing exactly what Čapek actually wants to do. They are dressed like people, but they are supposed to be talking in a slightly mechanical way, and you kind of instinctively did this. The right picture is from the last act 3, the last scene, and this is, you guessed it, this is how it all ends up. The robots don't have to be liberated or anything, they liberate themselves, actually take over. And Alquist, here in the middle, he is literally the last surviving human being. And the robots have now taken over the world. The funny thing is they have lost, actually, Helena burnt the instructions for reproduction. So the one thing they cannot do, they cannot reproduce. And then the question is how this, so if effectively the robots are facing annihilation as well because they cannot reproduce. And then happens in this, Čapek labeled this play as a comedy actually. What then happens is that there's a, if you will, rebirth of life, if you will, life 2.0. There will now be a robot Helena, and she comes up with another, she, if you will, hooks up with another robot, Primus, and they become, if you will, robot Adam and Eve, exactly, and then there is this kind of rebirth of life itself. Okay, here again, pointers. So one thing I think why this play is particularly interesting because again it accepts this challenge of staging a non-human human identity, right? It's as an evolving binary. That's actually what happens in this particular play. That the robots actually over the course of the play become more and more human-like. They actually start to feel pain. At the very end, they actually start to feel love. In this last scene, which is clearly kind of the mirror scene to the scene you just heard, the robot Helena actually does not want to be cut down because she's in love with Primus, and Primus actually wants to sacrifice himself for his love. So there's this sense now of, if you will, emotional investment and sacrifice out of love for someone else. Pointer 2, yes, the use of paralinguistic science to stage this kind of personhood, robotic personhood, robots dressed as people, but, and again I'm quoting from Čapek, slightly more mechanical in their speech and movements. Pointer 3, the strong sense, and you didn't quite get this from the scene, but there's a strong sense of economics and in the industrialization of labor throughout. It's part of the very fascinating aspects of this. So it's not necessarily just a dystopian play. It thinks actually quite hard about economic implications of AI and robotics. 4, pain and fear, especially of death, as the litmus test of human identity. If, and that's for AI people, that's a crucial question to emerge as well, what actually with ChatGPT and whatever, and in the future, what actually how will that change human identity, and how will that be defined? And the pain and fear actually seem to be, are in this play 2 defining features. The sense of comedy, and many of you did laugh, yes. In this scene right now, this whole thing about assuming false identity, it could be a Shakespearean kind of thing. Are you a robot? No, I'm not a robot. Later on in this scene, she will actually think that they are humans, but she thinks now actually those are robots, so it's exactly the other way around. There's also this perceived need for empathetic intervention. So Helena is the one who, I want to free you robots right now, which is in itself also kind of comical and slightly silly. Pointer 5, this is one of these extreme AI scenarios, right? Dawn of the robots, they are taking over, this kind of thing. It's going, again, talking about scale. It's this extreme, this singularity is taking over. And when you start talking to AI people, they're starting to get a bit bored by kind of these kind of, world is coming to an end. They think we should really talk much more practical things, how we do actually program these algorithms, that they're not intrinsically racist, and that's kind of the more important thing we have to do before we think about the world coming to an end. Yeah, the arrogance of the human species, that's another thing. Throughout this play, they always seem to think that they are in control when they actually aren't. They also have no idea of other species, for instance, the animal kingdom or whatever, that will actually survive this particular quote-unquote catastrophe. And then the overall last point of the overall trajectory from non-human to post-human. So this prologue scene is foiled to the final scene, where robots do cling to life. That's actually what has changed at the very end, actually. They do cling to life. And life itself, actually, if you will, survives in this new robotic form. Life will not perish. This is Alquist this last surviving human being, more or less at the very end of the play. All right, let me conclude at this point. What can the medium of theatre do for the sciences? And here on this slide, again, I'm not claiming that this is exhaustive in any way, but these are my thoughts about specific feature of theatre that I think can be extraordinarily useful for this kind of thing. First of all, theatre as an embodied art form. And again, I believe I've talked a fair amount about the possible. Give you one example, this climate change play that I just talked about, Sila, by Chantal Bilodeau, a Canadian playwright, has polar bears in it as characters. So as an embodied performance art, the theatre is able to give voice, presence, body to stakeholders that may be marginalized, suppressed, that are not being given a voice. Rossum's Universal Robots actually has one character, the nurse Nana, and she's, if you will, the traditionalist. She talks that she's kind of the anti-scientific prejudice, and Čapek gives her a voice. Aristophanes gives Strepsiades a voice. That's, I think, very important. So theatre can be controversial. It can actually give voice to these entities. But in particular with things like environmental sciences, it can actually give voice to Mother Earth. It can give voice to winds and this kind of thing. The theatre is, at least in my view, it's a technological regression. It's actually by comparison to all these media of acceleration, faster, more clumsy, whatever. The theatre is actually a very primitive art form. And this regression may actually be not a liability, it may actually be an asset. I also, just as a side remark, the theatre is also one of these few places, perhaps the only place, where people are still being asked to turn off their cell phones, for instance, for an hour and a half or 2 hours. So that's, again, a technological regression. That has lots of opportunities, I believe. It's collaborative, as science is, of course. It is participatory and emotionally engaging. It's polyphonous. It harks back to my earlier point about giving voice to all these entities. It's built on physical co-presence. It's built on liveness. It is decelerating. I think the deceleration of theatre, or potentially decelerating, slower, zoom in, take time. I think it's a definite asset, actually, in this discussion. It's socio-historically anchored, has high cultural capital. So again, the idea would be to leverage all these aspects for holistic learning, impact, need for consent, and need for behavioral change. So essentially, so in these next 3 slides, I simply rehash at a slightly more sophisticated level, perhaps, how I started this talk. Theatre and performance can do something for the sciences. The motto, if you will, think through by playing through, in order to effect the impact, need for consent, need for behavioral change. I've already hinted at that. It's dawning on me that through this project, that what we really need is also a different and a new conceptualization of what scientific knowledge actually is. Again, with these challenges, and that includes asking questions: where does scientific knowledge begin and end? Who actually needs to quote unquote know, and what do we need to know, and what kind of level of knowing do we actually need? Not every physicist actually knows everything about quantum physics. They're also quite highly specialized too, and that seems to be okay. There seems to be a very broad spectrum of competences actually. And then who needs to know what, and at what level of sophistication? Again, also assuming that what we also need is a basic set of, if you will, scientific literacy, where the theatre can, I think, make quite substantial contributions. Yes, vital contributions to such reconceptualized scientific knowledge. Theatre gives body, voice, and agency to a whole range of stakeholders, including marginalized and suppressed ones. The theatre engages larger and also, very importantly, non-scientific communities, and the theatre engages in a variety of contexts. And again, this too is dawning on me that the true, if you will, leverage and future of this kind of thinking may not be, if you will, in the entertainment arts kind of scene, but much more actually in pedagogical context, especially at the post-secondary and university level, but also in schools, of course. So this is essentially how I would like to conclude what are potential kind of applications here, and then we are in applied theatre studies, I guess. Think through by playing through, group reading, scene studies, role play exercises, creative rewritings, adaptations, enacting experiments. And finally, my localization. You may recall and relate to the middle icon. JLU, Neue Wege, seit 1607. Yes, integrated thinking the research pedagogies in your local academic environment. That's essentially the question I had for you. What are the new ways that could come out of this here and in the here and now? All right.